we'll get more into the politics of it as well, because it seems like, it's a weird situation, because uh, beyond, like, the nuclear issue, or the military issue. It looks like the Americans and the Australians were entirely, I guess, duplicitous with the French. I mean, the French have described this as a stab in the back. The French have pulled their ambassadors from both America and Australia. They've postponed upcoming talks with the UK. They're blocking talks over a trade deal with Australia. And it's very interesting too, because as far as this whole let's all go after China policy that we've been seeing under Trump and Biden. Under Biden, the French have been very involved. In fact, even leading naval drills in the Bay of Bengal with the Quad back in April. These were called the La Perouse exercises. They were in drills with the U.S., Japan, and France in the East China Sea back in May. And we had the Japanese defense minister come out and say they were looking forward to expanding military ties with like-minded countries beyond the U.S. He described France as a like-minded country that shares with Japan the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So it's quite interesting to see how all of this is playing out. I mean, I suppose the Americans think Australia is more strategically important in this Asia pivot because of its location in the Pacific. But yeah, no, I mean, the French have never withdrawn their ambassadors in the 200-year, in the 2 centuries or more of relations. This is our oldest ally. So it's, yeah. And I guess we'll get into the details of the actual, the politics of all this and what the whole agreement over the subs entails. Australia originally had, and they still do, these 6 Collins-class submarines. There's a really good piece from Moon of Alabama about this called "To Protect Itself from U.S. Hostility, Australia Decides to Buy U.S. Submarines." And so they've had these 6 Collins-class submarines. They're diesel-driven boats with Swedish designs that are partially built in Australia. They're slow. They have a medium range and endurance. There was lots of trouble building them because Australia, as Bernard here says, they lack the technical capabilities and industrial depth to make such complicated products. But in the 2010s, Australia started looking for a new generation of submarines, and there was kind of a debate over this, but they ultimately decided to go with the conventional submarines, not the nuclear-powered ones. So there was a bidding. Germany, Japan, and France were bidding for the contract. France ultimately won it. Their state-owned shipbuilder company called Naval Group won the race, and they were going to make these 12 boats, these electric diesel submarines. And so essentially, I mean, France basically took their nuclear-driven, what's called their Barracuda class design, and they had to basically design a conventional power plant to run it because it's, these are usually nuclear-powered subs that France uses. So there were going to be delays and difficulties in that process. So Bernard quotes Peter Lee about this, and he says the program was officially troubled, with Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison holding a confab with Macron to get the project back on track. Although the contract was signed in 2016, construction hadn't begun yet. The first submarine under the program wasn't to be launched for another decade at least. They weren't expecting to get the subs until 2030, around 2030, and now it's looking like the American nuclear subs potentially won't be ready until 2040. But as Peter Lee was saying in this article, he goes, that doesn't fit well with Australia's Navy's ambition to fling its armed might against the Chinese in a war over Taiwan, which they predict Taiwan is going to be attacked in the next few years. So that creates an issue. And so there have been talk of spending, billions of dollars upgrading the subs that they have now, or even procuring some German subs in the interim. They were talking about threatening to cancel, or modifying the contract to do better, or going with somebody else. But now Bernard says that the talks with the French and the U.S. about switching to getting American nuclear subs, that this discussion had already begun last April, and so it was finalized this June amongst the U.S., the Australians, and the British in a summit, and that was before Macron met with Scott Morrison to discuss how to get the project back on track. And then on August 30th of this year, the French and Australian foreign and defense ministers met, and they issued a common declaration saying both sides are committed to deepen our defense industry cooperation and enhance the capability edge in the region. And it said ministers underlined the importance of the future submarine program. But 16 days later, there was this announcement that, in fact, that entire deal had been scrapped, that they were now going, and this is one of the largest defense contracts France had ever negotiated, that they were going to be going with the Americans. So the French came out and said, this is a stab in the back. The foreign minister has said they're angry and very bitter about this breakup. And he said he had spoken to his Australian counterpart days ago and received no indication of the move. And I mean, essentially, one of the main things that's also dangerous is that, as Ted Snyder and Bernard point out, is that these submarines are designed for they're not really. I mean, if you wanted to defend, ostensibly defend from a Chinese, naval invasion of Australia's maritime property, then conventional subs are sufficient and adequate for that, for that purpose. The nuclear subs are actually designed to do the kind of things that, the Americans would like to do, which is, to have their allies patrolling the South China Sea, sailing near Taiwan, and as Bernard says, plans to lay siege on a foreign coast far away from one's own coast. So these are faster, and obviously they have much more endurance, but they're going to cost like 50% more. It's very difficult because they require dedicated infrastructure and specialized nuclear training for the crews, which Australian has neither of which. And of course, they're going to have to be dependent on the Americans for the fuel. And as it looks like $3 billion is already sunk into the contract. France will now probably demand compensation for the cancellation, and they're getting less submarines in this new deal, so it'll decrease their patrolling capacity from about 4 to 2 to 3 concurrent submarines at sea, because for every one you have out at sea, you have to have 2 that are in refit or training. And so it's fascinating because Australia essentially, it's not like a better deal for them. They're clearly under pressure by the Americans to make this switch. And then I guess we can get into what John Mearsheimer was saying as he was describing the situation that Australia finds itself in.
All right, go ahead, Connor.
Yeah, so he says, let's see. So Mearsheimer gave a speech in an Australian think tank a couple of years ago, and he says that now some people say there's an alternative. You can go with China. And he goes, right, you have a choice here. You can go with China rather than the United States. There's 2 things I'll say about that. Number one, if you go with China, you want to understand that you are our enemy. You are then deciding to become an enemy of the United States because, again, we're talking about an intense security competition. You're either with us or against us. And if you're trading extensively with China and you're very friendly with China, you're undermining the United States in this security competition. You're feeding the beast from our perspective. And that is not going to make us happy. And when we're not happy, you do not want to underestimate how nasty we can be. He goes, just ask Fidel Castro. So then he's quoting a Caitlin Johnstone piece. She says, so Australia is not aligned with the U.S. to protect itself from China. Australia is aligned with the U.S. to protect itself from the U.S. So, I mean, I suppose they were concerned about, facing sanctions because, I mean, China is their strongest, their biggest, greatest trading partner. So, I mean, it is kind of absurd that they're concerned about, their maritime trade routes being under threat from their largest trading partner.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely crazy how the U.S. empire works, Connor, where, we are, our allies are only our allies because we're the biggest bully in town and they're afraid of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems to be the direction that everything is going. I mean, we saw it's interesting, too, because like I remember a report from the Financial Times several months back early on in Biden's administration where a source who they described as familiar with the situation said that the Quad would form the core of essentially of the anti-China policy under the Biden administration. And it's looking like that is the case even to uh, the negation of because I mean, Biden had come out and given that speech, I believe, in April, his first address to Congress, where he said, "I told Xi Jinping we're going to militarize the Indo-Pacific like we do with NATO and Eastern Europe." And so you saw, the British sending in the HMS Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier strike group with, American, warplanes in that fleet, and you had the Germans sending warships into the South China Sea. The French early on sent a nuclear attack submarine into the South China Sea. And it seemed like the Europeans were getting in on this, and they may still be. But I guess it'll be interesting to see how France responds to this. I guess there's supposed to be a call later this week between Macron and Biden they're demanding clarification over what happened from the Americans. And it's interesting, too, because the Australians are essentially coming out and saying, well, we were upfront and honest with them about all of this. And, but the French are saying that's completely untrue. And I think from just that joint statement from back in August, it appears that the Australians are totally lying about that. So it just seems like they're, I mean, it might be an indication of how chaotic things are at the White House. I mean, we're watching sort of the empire, as you say, in decline. So, I mean, it just doesn't seem like they've thought this through so much, except it benefits the military-industrial complex, I suppose. But beyond that, it seems like a losing strategy to just perpetually stoke tensions at the cost of, major alliances. We'll see where it goes, but I mean, it's pretty incoherent at this point.
I guess I would add that I think, maybe you're looking at it just from like the geopolitical perspective. And I think there may be a political win here. Having a new alliance with English speaking countries is something that Americans generally like and think, I'm sure that the perspective of this, because I haven't seen a lot of good coverage on it in the mainstream media. Most of it has just been like, hey, it's here. This is a thing. Most Americans were like, oh, Trump was so terrible for, harming the U.S. and sacred relationship with our European partners and all that. And so, I guess I don't think many Americans could think through these things enough to see that there's daylight between, the U.K. and Australia and France. And so they just, kind of assume that if something is good for the U.K., it's good for all of Europe in general. And I'm guessing he's going to score a political win out of this, when it's really fascinating that, of course, he criticized Trump for demonizing China too much, and here this is another part of his anti-China policy.